Hello and a warm welcome. Thank you so much for joining us on this special edition of Invest Africa. I'm Guguletu Mfupi. While the unfavorable investment climate in many African states results from poor governance, institutional failures macroeconomic policy imperfections and inadequate infrastructure. Now, what efforts have been made to reform regulatory systems and boost investor confidence? Well, joining me in studio now to discuss investment incentives and disincentives in Africa is Dumelo Chipfupa. He's the director at Kova Advisory and Associates, and Sven Richter, head of frontier markets at Renaissance, or rather that is Ren Asset Management, to get it right. Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us today in studio. Interesting discussion, no doubt, but perhaps if we take a look at the African landscape, are we getting things right with regard to providing incentives for foreign direct investment? Sven?
Well, firstly, in terms of your introduction, there are a lot of things in Africa that have to be dealt with. That will make it more attractive for investors to come in. But a number of those things have already been dealt with, and there already is a high growth rate, which is actually attracting a lot of people to the continent at the moment, and people are looking at the continent. So I think what government needs to do now is really, or governments throughout the continent, is really to focus on what I would call certainty and the environment, and improving that to allow this demand for investment in the continent to actually unleash properly and invest in the continent.
Interesting point that you mentioned there. Dumelo, to get your perspective?
Yeah, I agree with Zen that, there's certainly been notable achievements around issues of governance on the continent. We've got less conflict than we had previously. We've seen the growth rate, increasing on the continent as a result of improved governance. I think one of the areas that we also need to focus on is to focus on this idea of manufacturing, getting manufacturing going on the continent. To a large extent, we are still dependent on resources for the growth of the continent. Yeah.
It's so true that you mentioned that, because that obviously ties in with economic growth, which I think you might allude to.
And that's exactly that. The challenge is that we mine things, or we grow things in Africa, we send it off somewhere else, it gets value added to it, and then we bring it back in to consume it ourselves. Okay, and we need to, within Africa, produce a lot more of that extra added value, and that's where some of the constraints are holding back in terms of that.
So perhaps let's get into some of the nitty-gritty issues as to how do we fix this and how do we get it right. Perhaps tax breaks. Tax incentives are always earmarked as maybe being one of the better policies to institute. I know from a South African example, we offer 150% as a tax break. That's as long as your research and development projects are registered in South Africa. You've been instrumental with regard to this, Dumelo. So the resident expert, is this working, and is it enough? Is it sustainable too?
Yes, of course. I do think that investment incentives are necessary, and in my limited experience, of course, with manufacturing incentives, I think that they're working. One of the most well-known incentives in South Africa is the auto investment incentive, and we do have an auto sector that is growing, that is thriving. And I think the success of that we owe largely to investment incentives. I do think, though, that when we talk to investors, they do think that incentives are important, but there are other issues that I mean, recently some of the investors that I've been talking with, they're talking about this issue of limited markets. In the sense that most of African economies, in terms of populations, they're quite small. And so investors that we are talking to are interested in finding out on the progress that is being made with, regional integration, promoting intra-African trade, making sure that the infrastructure is there to export through in the continent, and so forth. I think those are some of the policies that we need to work on if at all we are going to get manufacturing going on the continent.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, but my immediate thought that came to mind was that might be difficult to process. You've got ECOWAS, you've got the EAC, as well as SADC, but all these different nations also have their own legal policies, in particular when it comes to tax. Sven?
They do, but I do think it has been some movement towards it. As you say, I mean, there's already a Southern African grouping, there's an Eastern African grouping, there's a Western African grouping. It's not that we have to, from day one, get the whole economy, or the whole continent, into one single, sort of region. Each region in itself, I mean, we as investors think of our Kenyan investments as investing in a sort of a country, and inverted commas a country, of 120 million people, because there's 40 million in Kenya, but if you include the region, and Kenya is quite advanced in regionalizing that economy, you know, a lot of the investments we make in Kenya have operations in South Sudan, Uganda, Tanzania, etc. So for us, it already is a region in the east of Africa. West, a little bit more divided at this point in time, but you've got a country like Nigeria, which has got 180 million people, which is obviously attractive. The thing is, where I would like to go back a little bit, you know, in terms of some of the things that my fellow panelists said here, is that in South Africa, we're quite developed in terms of things like infrastructure, and some of the constraints for investing have been taken away already. So in some ways, when we here in South Africa do incentives, they really benefit the people who come to them and they attract people. Whereas if you're further north of South Africa, where the infrastructure is slightly less, maybe we have to look at the infrastructure first before we start doing incentives, because incentives do not impact as much as they should, because people are still having to deal with infrastructure that needs to be developed.
No doubt a multi-pronged approach, but then does that mean that we need to focus on incentives for a particular industry, maybe energy and infrastructure first, before we look at incentivizing a research and development and technology projects?
Yes, I mean infrastructure such as energy and transportation, and the ease which it, and sort of in terms of getting things through the ports. You know, you want to bring something in without red tape and in a short period of time, and you want to take it out without red tape and easily and in a short period of time, because all the time that you have a ship waiting there, or you have your shipment at the port waiting, it costs you money.
So true. Dumelo?
Yeah, and I agree with them that, you know, I mean, before even one looks at fiscal incentives, issues like infrastructure are quite important. The ports, how quickly you can move goods through the ports and so forth. It's issues that are quite important, obviously, in investing. And I think one of the areas where we could learn from is China. China, obviously, you know, making changes around infrastructure and so forth takes quite a long time. And one of the things that the Chinese did was to establish so-called special economic zones, you know, where you could focus on a small area, provide infrastructure there, make that, you know, it's a hospitable place for business. And then later on, as you develop that region, you are able to get development going into further inland. And I think that's what the Chinese have done. I think a number of African countries are beginning to look at special economic zones. We are certainly doing that in South Africa. And it's one of the things that we can be looking at, yeah.
Well, no doubt it is on the agenda, and I know the both of you travel quite often across the continent and across the country. Some of these hubs that you mentioned, are there any practical examples that we can look to?
Well, let me defer to somebody for CISA.
Well, one of the most successful, I mean, economies in Africa that has utilized special economic zones is Mauritius. You know, Mauritius used to be I guess, tourism economy, but they've been able to build an industry around clothing and so forth, you know, based on EPZ, you know. And in fact, the Mauritian EPZ success story is one that is quite well celebrated internationally. Yeah.
Coming back to that focus on infrastructure just once again, as you mentioned, those projects take a long time to come on board. Is this perhaps pushing away infrastructure, foreign direct investment to coming into certain areas on the continent?
Well, I think it is, because, you know, if you are a foreign firm and you want to put a manufacturing facility somewhere in the world, you have a lot of places to look at. You know, you can put something into Vietnam if you want. You know, you could go to China as well, even though China is becoming more expensive now. So it's saying, well, do we go to Vietnam? Do we go to Pakistan? Do we go to somewhere in Eastern Europe, which might be even closer to some of the markets that we want to service? Or do we come to somewhere in Africa? So yes, I think lack of infrastructure is pushing investment away. But there's not much we can do about it at this stage. The infrastructure is where it is. All we can do about it is, as fast as possible, grow infrastructure. And this infrastructure is growing. If you just go to countries throughout Africa, you look at the new roads they're putting in, you look at the money they're starting to put in terms of railroads, you look at the improvements they've done in terms of ports so far, even though there's still a way to go, it is coming. And all we can do is accelerate that and make it more attractive for people to invest.
So true. I want to come back to the issue, though, regarding tax breaks. And my question is this sustainable, given the fact that government still needs to source some kind of revenue from somewhere? So if you're giving every person or every investor in various sectors some kind of tax break, is that sustainable in the long term, given the fact that you need to maintain your revenue streams?
If you did not have a factory there, and because of a tax break, you now have a factory employing local people, sourcing local products. Net, are you not better off?
Because now you've got a population from which you can tax, and they also play contributing to that.
Yes, and you had people who might not have had jobs beforehand. Okay, now they've got jobs. You had resources that might not have been added value to in your country, and you also, if you put a factory in place, you're going to also get local people supplying accounting skills to it. You're going to get local people supplying food for the canteen or something like that. All of those things that weren't in place before. So I don't think you should have a tax break forever, because you need to build up your tax bases. But if you have, say, a 5-year, for instance, tax break, for 5 years you just get the ancillary benefits from that manufacturing facility, but after that you get both benefits.
Which also highlights the need from a regulatory perspective to oversee that too.
Yes.
And that's where I was coming to say that, and in my experience, I think in South Africa, we are quite good in making sure that we monitor the tax breaks that we offer, or the incentives that we offer. We regularly make sure that, there is a review, and the tax breaks are not there forever. Like with the automotive programs, they're normally around for a 7-year period, and after 7 years there's a review. Has this worked? Has it not worked? Where can we strengthen? Where can we improve? What have been the benefits? What should be the focus of the tax incentives? So yes, if you are going to be offering tax breaks and incentives, it's quite important that monitoring and evaluation, you build that kind of capacity.
Which also means that you beef up your regulatory system and also review legislation. One particular area of legislation that comes to mind, especially with the ongoing platinum strikes that we have in South Africa, is the labor issue, because you need to at least pay taxes as an investor in a country, as well as employ the country's people. But are the people employable, first of all, and how do you manage crisis situations like what we have on the platinum belt at the moment?
Well, I think that Africans are employable without a doubt. Yes, there's maybe some lesser skills than there are in some highly developed countries like Germany, and that's something that has to improve over time. But I think naturally, as you have investment, that improves, because companies tend to train people who they need to do certain jobs. So yes, I think without a doubt that Africans are definitely employable and can do as good a job as someone else, as long as they're managed properly. Okay, and I think that's throughout the world. Management has to deal with these issues, and management cannot abdicate itself from dealing with these issues. And sometimes management tends to take a step back, hope that the unions will take over some of their role, instead of sort of engaging as much as they should with people. And then when they realize there's problems, they then don't quite know where to turn, because they haven't engaged as much as they should with their workforce.
Dumelo, just very quickly, from your perspective with the automobile sector and manufacturing, have you found that there's also been a transference of skills?
Definitely, there's obviously been, the auto industry, it's one of the more technologically developed industries across the world. So it would tend to employ people who are semi-skilled to more skilled people. So they do train quite a lot in the auto industry. So there is a transfer of skills, but there's also a transfer of technology to smaller and medium enterprises that supply components into the auto industry, in the sense that, over time, what government has set up is that we want to increase local value added. So we are trying to influence government is trying to influence the sourcing strategies of these companies. And so as they source more locally, we begin to build up the technological know-how among small and medium enterprises within the economy.
Well, judging by the first half of this conversation, it does seem as though South Africa is on a roll. But after the break, we'll also add an international voice to this discussion, and that's Jeremy Cape. He's a partner at Dentos. But do stay with us. We'll be back in the next 2 minutes. A warm welcome back to Invest Africa. Now, do remember that we value your suggestions and feedback, so please send us an email to investafrica@abn360.com, or interact with us on Twitter through @CNBC Africa, #InvestAfrica. But still on our discussion today with my guest, Dumelo Chipfupa, Director at Cova Advisory and Associates, Sven Richter, Head of Ren Asset Management there, Frontier Markets at that organization, and from our London studios, we are joined by Jeremy Cape. He's a partner at Dentos. in totes. Thank you so much for joining us, gentlemen. Perhaps if we pick up with your view here, Jeremy, from an international perspective. Just before the ad break, we touched on labor in the South African sphere, and if that perhaps is a deterrent to foreign direct investment. From your view as an outsider looking in, when you look at the rest of the continent, is that a key issue for investors?
No, I mean, there are many issues for foreign investors going into Africa, and of course labour is a key one in terms of making that investment decision. Now, I come at things very much from the tax side. I'm a tax partner at Denton's in London, and one thing that's absolutely key is the ease of being able to employ, whether from an employment law point of view, the ability to hire, to fire, to educate, to continue to train, but also in terms of the compliance. One of the real issues for an investor going into an African country for the first time is the ability to be able to deal with the tax authority in that country. And the worst thing that happens, and I see it unfortunately quite a lot, is that the moment that an investor comes in and is employing hundreds or perhaps thousands of individuals, he knows that there is going to be a problem with a tax authority because the officials are going to look at him as a target to get more revenue, rightly or wrongly.
I want us to follow up with that. Even though we have covered tax rates in the first half, Sven and Tumelo and myself, we've all managed to agree that net, the effective tax breaks for an African economy will have a benefit overall. But as you mentioned, it does seem as though that's a key concern. Now, are there any economic hubs where you've noticed that oftentimes investors encounter quite significant problems there?
Well, I wouldn't want to name any particular names. Your viewers can probably guess what they would be, but I would say that things are generally improving. I think as many countries break the tax authorities off from the finance ministries and get an elite number of employees, of officials who are able to concentrate on tax rather than going through the civil service, and that they get incentivized in the right way, not by raising assessments and to run disputes for 6 years with investors and the companies which they establish, but to try and work hand in hand as stakeholders, realizing that as your other guest said, there are many favourable knock-on effects from having the international investment. And yes, some tax should be paid, but that it shouldn't be pushed to sort of kill the goose that is laying the golden egg. And yeah, unfortunately I see many jurisdictions, and frankly not just in Africa, the UK can be bad at times, but the flavour is definitely positive.
The flavour is definitely
in terms of that, I think very much so. I agree with you that there has been a change. I mean, if I just go back 20 years ago to when I first started travelling to Nigeria, there was a number of special tax regimes in place at that stage. This was, let me state, this was 20 years ago. There was a mast tax if your mast was too high. But there was no specification as to how high was too high, okay. There was also a back taxes in terms of company tax, and it consisted of a gentleman who had a support of an army sort of platoon behind him. He'd go around, he'd visit the company, he'd look at their books, he'd say how much, and he received a percentage of how much he got,
sure.
Okay. And there was no statute saying how much they should pay, okay. Now, I mean, so that is 20 years ago. So we've come a long way. But yes, the infrastructure needs to be firmed up all the time. And when I talk about infrastructure, I never just talk about railroads and roads, the physical. It's also the institutional infrastructure that we need to see improved. It's the fact that when you start a business, you should be able to go to the tax authority, to the authority who gives you the license, and there should be a clear terms of what you do. You must pay your fair share. You mustn't be able to pay underneath your fair share for anything, because that would also be wrong. But you must know there must be certain shares to what you're going to get.
Is that happening though on the continent?
Yes, my understanding, I mean, from all indicators are that, I mean, the institutional environment or the governance environment is improving on the continent. But in all fairness to African governments, some of the problems that we also have it's multinationals, on these issues of transfer pricing and paying too little tax, So we've got companies coming here, investing, creating jobs and so forth, but trying to find creative ways of not paying their dues, you know, their tax dues. And I think that there's actually a high-level panel that former President Mbeki was on that was looking at this particular issues of, you know, how do we get companies to stop using aggressive tax avoidance measures. Yeah.
That's so true. And perhaps it also brings us to the topic of bilateral agreements. Jeremy, perhaps you can weigh in on this discussion, whether they serve a purpose or also have several loopholes within them.
Yeah, no, bilateral investment treaties, tax treaties very much go hand in hand. Certainly the tendency has been to enter into more bilateral investment treaties in recent years. I think there were about 2,000 in the year 2000. There are over 3,000 now, albeit that some countries are now looking to terminate. Certainly the clients of Denton's will be looking for bilateral investment treaties before investing into a country, because sadly there have been many steps taken by governments, and still which are taken by governments again across the world, which mean that their investments can be put under some pressure, and that can be as naked as confiscation, or it can be the introduction of confiscatory type tax regimes. Now again, it is I think almost universally accepted that the assault that has been made on tax laws in Africa in terms of transfer mispricing that has been done over the decades is probably at an end. And personally, I think that that's probably the correct thing. But you are seeing a case where an investor will have been brought into a country to generate jobs, to generate wider income and wealth in that country on a certain basis, and that can be quite a marginal decision, looking at one country over another, and certain assurances will have been made. Now, if you go in and suddenly you find either that there have been changes to your terms of engagement, or there's some crazy decisions coming out of the judiciary, or that suddenly a capital gains tax is being introduced for when you as a non-resident dispose of your shares in the underlying company, then it's not unreasonable to wish to seek protection through a bilateral investment treaty. So I think, notwithstanding that there are some countries that are looking to terminate or replace their bilateral investment treaties, those are going to be on the horizon and are going to be very important to investors, sometimes even more so than having tax treaties in place.
Well, another contentious issue often comes down to ownership, and just earlier on we were discussing the fact that across the continent, depending on where you go, it's referred to by different names: indigenization, BEE, or local ownership. But this is also something that foreign investors need to deal with. Sven?
Yes, I think the first thing, that there must be certainty. You can't keep changing the goalposts. If you change the goalposts, no one has any clue as to what's going on, number one. And I think there can be some levels of local ownership that are implemented, but you must realize that anyone who puts money into any investment anywhere in the world wants to, if they're going to put up 100% of the capital, and they're going to have their technology there, and they're going to have their management there, they're also going to want to control that. And you cannot expect them to cede control to someone else. So the first thing is they're going to want control. Second thing is they're going to want economic return, and that depends on the general environment. Now, the more uncertainty there is in any environment, the higher return they're going to want from the investment. And then there is room for local ownership levels, but it must be certain, and it must have a long-term visibility in terms of that, so people can have certainty.
So true, because we know that on the South African landscape as well, we run the risk of uncertainty with regard to policy. But Jeremy, just to get your voice in with regard to this, when you look across the African landscape, perhaps you can't pinpoint the bad apples, but are there any good ones where, you know, legislation is rather clear and concise with regard to ownership?
On ownership, I think there are some of the East African jurisdictions are moving positively. Again, I agree with Sven that the clarity is absolutely essential in this. In so many cases, whether it is in terms of local ownership, in terms of investment protection, in terms of taxation, it really is just a matter of knowing what the laws are and knowing that there will be some stability in relation to those going forward. So no, I've seen some positive noises coming out of East Africa, and long may that continue.
Well, we certainly hope so, but one also wonders whether privatization is always the answer. We see it unfolding in the Nigerian landscape. Is it enough to, or are there incentives where one can encourage some kind of privatization in various centers or rather economic hubs?
Yeah, in South Africa, obviously, I think there's been a retreat on you know, that type of, you know, wholesale privatization. I think there's a rethinking in the sense that, you know, privatization, it's not necessarily always the best policy, and it appears like the South African government has decided to take a case-by-case and a much more pragmatic, you know, role to pragmatic view on privatization. And I think it's something that one sees, you know, around the world. Obviously, there was a time when, you know, Margaret Thatcher started this whole wave in the UK and so forth, where everybody thought that privatization was the way to go. But I think that there's been a retreat from that type of policy, and people are saying more, it needs to be fairly well thought through. Yeah, because sometimes you privatize, and what used to be a public monopoly, you turn it into a private monopoly, and there is no net gain to the economy in privatizing in those type of instances.
That's so true.
Yeah, I agree. We shouldn't have monopolies. That I do agree with you. But I think if you look throughout the world, the vast majority of countries where they have more privatized operating entities and government-owned entities tend to deliver more for their population than the ones that have more government-owned entities. And so I have a fairly strong views on that. But I agree with you very much. You cannot have a monopoly. You cannot hand a monopoly to someone, because that's not going to benefit anyone at the end of the day.
So true. So, guys, we have to leave it there, unfortunately, because we've run out of time. But very quickly, I'm going to steal 10 seconds. On a scale of 1 to 10, how do we fare with regard to incentives for foreign direct investment on the continent?
I think given our growth rates, I think Africa is one of the fastest growing continents in the world, and we are at 7 or 8 in terms of if you want to invest in Africa, you should be coming here.
Perfect. Tumelo, your number?
I think I would rate it an 8 also. Africa is growing quite fast. It's one of the fastest growing, and if at all you are serious about business, you should be in Africa.
Perfect. Jeremy, very quickly, your number?
I'm playing the populist card. I'm going for a 9.
Well, it does seem as though we have a very nice consensus, 8 or 9 out of 10. Well, I'm not complaining as an African resident. Thank you so much to my guests today. We have come to the end of this week's episode for Invest Africa. But once again, thank you to our guests for joining us today and including themselves in this amazing discussion. But up next, Bruce Whitfield is next to unpack the latest news from South Africa's economy on Tonight with Bruce. But until next time, it's goodbye and thank you for joining us.